Well, we have come to the end of another week as it is Friday, and I hope everybody will have a good weekend this weekend and then a great day on Sunday to get the next week started. And for our Friday focus, we are continuing in Hebrews chapter 11, where we left off last time. And in Hebrews chapter 11, the Hebrews writer began to talk about faith, because again he's talking to some folks who are wavering in their faith, weak in their faith, struggling in their faith. And the Hebrews writer has reminded them all about Jesus and all that Jesus has done for us and what that means for us and our salvation, and then about how we need to hold on, we need to be faithful, and we need to keep the faith and hold fast to Jesus. And he began to talk in Hebrews chapter 11 about faith and reminding them what faith is, this faith that we have in God. And then he talked about the example of Abel and of Enoch and of Noah, and how verse 6, without faith, it is impossible to please God. For those who come to him must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Well, the Hebrews writer has some more examples that he wants to share about those who had faith in God, those who lived for God, those who obeyed God, those who, despite some great challenges, kept the faith. And one of those, the next one he talks about, is that of Abraham. And if you really go back, the Hebrews writer is going to highlight really and sum up some of the main events of Abraham's life and of his descendants. But you really look at the life of Abraham back in the book of Genesis, and you really look and see his journey of faith. Abraham, for him, faith in God was definitely, as for everybody else, a learning process. But he had faith in God, no matter the challenges, no matter how hard it was, no matter, even if he didn't understand fully what God's plan was or what God was going to do. We see, as the Hebrews writer reminds us and highlights for us, that Abraham had faith in God no matter what. So let's look at this together, beginning in Hebrews chapter 11, picking up in verse 8, when he tells us that by faith in God, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. Remember, God came to Abraham and said, when he was Abram, and said, come, go to the land, follow me, go to the land that I am going to show you. But God didn't tell him anything more than that. Abraham totally had to have faith in God, that God was calling him to follow him and that God was going to grant him this inheritance. But Abraham did not know where he was going. But he put his faith and trust in God no matter what. And then by faith, Abraham dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. You know, the Hebrews writer stresses that the land that God promised to give Abraham and his descendants, Abraham, even Isaac and Jacob, as he says, dwelt in it as foreigners, dwelt in tents, lived a nomadic life. They had no land really to call their own, even though God had promised it to them. But he was waiting, verse 10, Abraham, he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Abraham knew whatever God was bringing, all that God had promised, was going to be worth it, that God was going to do it, and he put his faith and trust in God. Even Sarah, we're told about Sarah, verse 11. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged God faithful who had promised. For Sarah, faith was a learning process as well. But she had that faith in God, that God was going to fulfill his promise of giving her a child. And therefore, from one man, Abraham, and him as good as dead, old age, Sarah passed the days of childbearing, Abraham an old man himself, But therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky, in multitude innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore, just as God had promised. Just as God promised Abraham that his descendants would be just like the sand, just like the stars. But for a time, Abraham and Sarah had no idea how that was going to work, because they're both old. Sarah passed the age of childbirth, but God made it happen. Abraham and Sarah had faith in God. We see this even when Abraham and Sarah, even when they couldn't themselves understand or see how God was going to make this happen. And go back to the book of Genesis, they really struggled with it, but they came to faith in God and put their trust in Him, that God was going to do what He said He was going to do. And then the Hebrews writer mentions here, and kind of interjects here in beginning of verse 13, the hope of it all. Their hope, Abraham's hope, those after him, really all the people of faith's hope, but especially talking about Abraham and those with him and after him, that these all died in faith, not having received the things promised. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob died in faith, not having received the things promised. But they knew, number one, God was going to do it. But also, notice it says, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. They had hope. They had faith in God, that God would bring about His promises. And so they were content. They were happy to consider themselves strangers and pilgrims on earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind the country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. I mean, Abraham at any point in time could have given up, could have said, God, I'm not seeing this working. I don't have the land yet. I'm going back home. But he didn't. Because it says, but now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared a city for them. They put their faith and trust in God, in the city of God, the heavenly country. It was not just about this earthly life, this earthly land, but ultimately God bringing in eternal blessings. And they put their faith and their hope and their trust in God, which is what we got to do. What they needed to do is to see that heavenly home, that better country that's coming, that God has promised, and to keep the faith, just like Abraham, just like Sarah, just like Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, as he goes on to say. Well, going back to Abraham, verse 17, by faith, when Abraham was tested, remember back in Genesis when he was tested, when God wanted him to offer up Isaac, he did. Abraham offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed will be called. When God came to Abraham and said, Abraham, I want you to take the promised child, your only son, whom you love, and I want you to offer him as a sacrifice. Abraham didn't hesitate. He did. No matter how hard it was, he did what God wanted him to do. Remember in the story, in the event that God ended up stopping him from doing it, providing a ram. But notice what the Hebrews writer says about Abraham. Abraham's faith in doing this, that he concluded that God was able to raise Isaac up, even from the dead, from which he also, in a figurative sense, did receive him. The Hebrews writer reveals to us that Abraham, in his faith, he didn't understand why God wanted to do this, but obviously God had made a promise through Isaac, believed that, well, if God was going to fulfill this promise, God could raise Isaac from the dead. So Abraham was going to sacrifice him, was going to kill him. But God stopped him from killing him, from finishing it. and provided a ram. And so in a sense, figurative sense, as the Hebrews writer says, Isaac was raised back to Abraham, was lifted up, was saved from death. But Abraham's faith and fear and willingness to obey God was proven that day. And then he goes on to say of Abraham's descendants, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. The faith of Abraham was passed on to his son Isaac, to his son Jacob, to Jacob's son Joseph. That faith in the promise, that trust in God passed down generation to generation. Isaac had faith, blessed Jacob and Esau about things coming. Jacob blessed Joseph about things coming. Joseph blessed his with things coming. He made mention about the departure of the children of Israel, gave instructions concerning his bones. Remember, Joseph said, when God comes, God's coming. And when God comes and delivers you, take my bones with you. They all had faith, that faith of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. They all show us what it is to have faith in the promises of God and to trust in Him. Now, we could talk a whole lot more about that, more time than we really intend for this particular video. But if you go back, it doesn't mean they were perfect. It doesn't mean Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, not perfect. They all had to learn and grow in their faith. We all have a journey of faith. But we've got to come to that faith in God, that trust in God and His plan and His promises, knowing He will fulfill His promises. And that was so needed for these Christians the Hebrews writer was writing to, because they needed to hold on. They didn't understand. They were suffering, struggling, thinking about quitting. But the Hebrews writer reminds them of how the promises of God works. You may not understand it all. It may be hard. It may be challenging. But if you will hold on, if you will have faith in God, in the end, He will bring about what He has promised. And we need to grow in our faith too, our trust and our hope in God. May we continue to do that. God bless.